Hi everybody, we're going to talk about survival of the openness, Microsoft's journey to open source. Hi, I'm Martin Woodward. You can get me on GitHub and Twitter at Martin Woodward.
And I'm Sasha Rosenbaum, and you can find me on GitHub and on Twitter by the same name, DivineOps. So let's get started talking a little bit about the Microsoft history. This was way before we had the fancy colorful logos. This was more like the days when we didn't have any fancy colors at all. And back then, Microsoft actually had opinions on open source. And Bill Gates actually had opinions on the GPL license, which was that he did not agree with it. And then Steve Ballmer took it even farther by saying Linux is a cancer, and we fought Linux at every step of the way.
Thankfully, times have changed. Brad Smith recently said that Microsoft was on the wrong side of history. He was our lawyer during a lot of these times. He also said if you live long enough, then you can change and you can make good on the things that you were doing. So in the colour world now, we have Satya Nadella, our CEO, who has a very, very different stance on open source. And it's great to see the company has really moved along. And what we want to do today is kind of show you some of this journey that we've been on. The past 5 years, the last 5 years, in fact, that I worked at Microsoft before moving over to GitHub, were a great change as we went through that time. I was very lucky enough to create Microsoft's GitHub account back in 2014. So that's when we had project number 1 on GitHub. And by 2016, we were one of the largest contributors to open source on GitHub. And then in 2019, when I left Microsoft, there were 25,000 employees inside of GitHub contributing to open source and over 8,500 projects. So that's a massive change in a short period of time. So what we wanted to do was just kind of take you through our journey in Microsoft and the steps that we went along, but hopefully in ways that you can kind of repeat some of these lessons and hopefully apply them to your organization if you want to get involved in open source.
So let's go to step 1, which is consume responsibly. For every organization, when they start considering using open source, before contributing, they actually start consuming open source. Right? And I have an important life lesson related to this. And that lesson is, don't be a jerk. Now, that's a good lesson for life, and it's also a good lesson for open source, because these open source maintainers actually don't owe you anything. Many of them are working on the projects in their spare time and for free. So the last thing you should do is send them an angry email demanding support for your products. Instead, you should sponsor them. Now at GitHub, we've introduced GitHub Sponsors, which allows you to sponsor the projects that you're most passionate about and help these open source maintainers have more time dedicated to the projects they love. So I want to ask you a question, even though I cannot see you. I wish I could, but do you use open source in your organization? So I can't see if you raise your hand, but I know that sometimes when I talk to large companies, they tell me that they do not use open source. But that's actually not true. From software composition analysis, we know that 99% of all organizations make extensive use of open source. And then 90% of all application development leverages open source software. And actually, very tiny percentage of your code is actually new code. Now, there's an important message related to this, and that is that you must worry about the security of the open source packages that you are consuming. Sometimes these packages can be buried in your dependency tree, and you still must always make sure that you are consuming responsibly. And in fact, some of the biggest hacks we know in the last couple of years were done through cracking the software, through breaching the software, through the supply chain vulnerability. We also know that breaches are extremely expensive. So if you actually get all the way to getting breached, it could cost you millions of dollars to remediate the breach. So the goal here is for us to shift security left, and also to educate developers and make it easy for developers to contribute to security, because there's a lot more developers than security researchers out there in the world. So with that in mind, at GitHub, we wanted to make it easier for you to secure your software in an automated fashion and consume open source responsibly. So we have introduced Dependabot that is helping you to secure your software supply chain. by alerting you on vulnerabilities and even producing automated PRs on your software supply chain vulnerabilities. And then we introduced code scanning with CodeQL, which is a static code analysis tool that can help you identify software security vulnerabilities in new code. And now you can run in the cloud with GitHub Actions. And we also introduced secret scanning for private repositories. So now you can identify secrets that were accidentally checked into your repository. So with that and with open source community in mind, we are making as many steps as we can to help you consume open source responsibly.
Next, we need to understand the business need to contribute. The first reason is around not forking. If you're consuming open source, quite often you'll take down an open source dependency and maybe you'll find a bug fix or a security issue and you fix it in a local version of that code because you need that fix immediately to run. If you don't take that fix and push it upstream, send it back to the upstream project, then it gets increasingly hard for you to take changes from that upstream project, bring them back down to your local version, and then merge them in with the changes you've made. So that means if you don't push upstream, you miss out on gaining all that functionality that's been added to the new version of the open source project and all of the security vulnerabilities and security patches that other people have applied. Therefore, by contributing, you're able to consume the latest version later on and stay up to date more easily. So that's one of the main business justifications for contributing to begin with. Next, we have the fact that open source communities value the code over everything else. If you're taking an open source dependency as a strategic dependency, you're basing a whole business around it, you want to have some kind of influence into the future direction of that open source project so you can make sure it goes in the way that you want it to go.